the legend of the vampire persists. One person is the donor for that group of, 8 and people, and they actually get together and drink blood.
Does your curiosity make you want to go and ask them more about it?
On the surface, it sounds bizarre. At the end of the day, nothing really replaces going out and putting yourself in with these people and trying to understand them. But even that's hard because a lot of them won't come on camera. All right, on today's episode of the GCT podcast, right before Halloween, we have a really special interview with Michael Bell. Now, today we're going to be talking about vampires, vampire lore, and if people really are vampires or if maybe they just have something else going on, and everything in between. So welcome to the show, Michael. I really appreciate you joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, no problem. Now, for people who might not know who you are, who are you and why are we here? Why are we talking to you about vampires?
Okay, well, my name is Michael Bell. I'm the retired state folklorist for the state of Rhode Island. And so I came here 1980, well, first in 1979.
Right.
And I was doing a short-term project and I'm still here. So obviously I found something to keep me here.
Right.
And one of those things that I found were the local vampire tradition.
Right. Now, when you say vampire tradition, what is a vampire tradition?
Well, as it exists in New England, which includes all of the New England states, especially Rhode Island.
Right.
Mainly, it's a folk medical practice.
Okay.
And that's the way the people here looked at it. I think I should be clear to say that the people involved in these rituals that I'm going to talk about, they didn't use the term vampires or vampire. So they did not refer to their dead relatives that they suspected of causing an illness, vampires.
Right.
Okay. So that's number one. And number two, these rituals were performed to try to stop what they considered a mysterious illness. At that time, it was called consumption.
Right.
Now we know it as pulmonary tuberculosis. But until the late 1800s, there was no known cause for tuberculosis, and therefore there was really no actual effective cure or treatment for tuberculosis. So
that's how human beings, we're definitely a curious little species that's more than willing to make up reasons when we don't know what the reason is. So,
right.
Yeah.
Well, I often start some of my talks by saying nature abhors a vacuum.
Right.
And human beings being part of nature, if we don't have an answer, then we have to find an answer somewhere.
Yeah.
And folklore, folk tradition, almost always, and I would say invariably has an answer.
Right.
For whatever problems you face. Now, it may not be the scientifically approved or the establishment validated answer, but there are times when just having an answer is enough.
Yeah.
If there's no other course of action. So that's really what we're talking about here. And people were basically at the end of the rope. If you can imagine yourself back in a situation, let's say mid to late 1800s, somebody in your family gets sick, they start wasting away. You visit whatever passes for a medical doctor at that time. And the doctor, if the doctor is being honest, will say, well, there's nothing more I can do about it. It's in the hands of God.
Right.
Or the doctor might recommend, well, let's bleed the patient. Or let's make the patient throw up. And, the galvanistic medical procedures, that's what they did. They tried to balance the humors, the four humors in the body. You got sick because these humors were out of balance. And so they would do various things to try to rebalance these humors. So they were basically shooting in the dark.
Well, how do vampires get wrapped up in all this?
Well, let me proceed with the ritual, and then I think it'll be pretty clear why outsiders saw what was going on as cases of vampirism.
Okay.
So you're at the last resort. other people in the family are dying. They're wasting away. Consumption is called consumption because that's what it does to your physical body.
Right.
Your mind usually stays pretty alert, so you know what's happening to you, but you also realize, having seen it in other people in your family and community, that there's nothing you can do that's going to stop it. So that's kind of a horrific place to be. You know what's coming, but you can't do anything to prevent it. So there was a folk remedy that was been passed down in families and communities that basically said there's some sort of an evil thing, a spirit, an angel, a dark thing that is inhabiting one of the dead relatives who has died of this disease. So we need to find out which one that is. So we would go to the cemetery, the families, or sometimes some of the neighbors would go with them. And they would exhume bodies of people in the family that had died of this disease. They're looking for signs that were deemed unnatural. Mainly, they were looking mainly for what they considered fresh blood in the heart or other vital organs. Now, any liquid inside the body, especially the vital organs, would be defined or interpreted at least as fresh blood. So how did fresh blood get into this corpse that's dead? Well, somehow sympathetically, from a distance, from the grave, it's draining out the life blood of living family members. So the cure, in most cases, was to cut out the offending organ and burn it to ashes, and sometimes feed the ashes to people in the family who were dying. And that was supposed to be the cure. There were other variants of this ritual. That's why we are pretty sure it was part of the folk traditions at the time, because you find variations from one community to the next. There are different approaches. Sometimes they were looking for a vine that was growing out of the coffin, maybe from the breast of the deceased person, out of the coffin. And often an associated belief was if that vine went to another coffin of a member of the family or community, then there would be another death. And so they would have to cut the vine and burn the vine, sometimes burn it along with the vital organs of the persons that they perceived to be causing the problem, the scapegoat, if you will. In Maine, there was a very simple and I think elegant ritual, and that was simply to turn the corpse upside down and then rebury it. I guess on the belief that if you're oriented down and not up out of the grave, then people up above the ground are safe.
Well, the thing I like about that idea is that you don't have to eat the ashes of your dead. I think
that's it. As I said, it's very simple and it's very elegant and not so messy.
So, when people, would, the families and the neighbors possibly would go exhume the body and, looking for signs of fresh blood, which in fairly recent corpse, they're probably going to find evidence of something that looks like blood at the very least. And you mentioned that they thought that it wasn't like a vampire in the sense like we think of today, like where it comes out at night and goes drinks people blood. You were saying like they felt that it was taking their blood, not leaving the grave. If
yes,
I'm correct.
Yes, that's in folklore and folk belief traditions that it's called a sympathetic connection. It's an invisible connection, in this case, between the deceased and the living. So the corpses were not coming out of the grave and sucking blood.
Right.
Like your classic literary or Gothic vampire.
Well, prior to, what you're describing in the 1800s, there's the folklore of vampires actually goes back quite a bit further than that, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah.
So
that all depends on how you define a vampire, and that's those are issues that are disputable by people. I mean, there are lumpers and there are splitters.
I don't know what
that those are categories used by taxonomists who put species in categories and give them names. So the splitters like the late folklorist Alan Dundas, who wrote about vampires. He said, no, the vampire is strictly a European monster, if you want to call it a monster. It's not worldwide. And then there are the lumpers who say, well, I mean, just if you define the boundaries a little bit more hazy and inclusive, then we've got vampires going back to ancient Greece. And in fact, the first woman in mythology, Lilith, was a vampire. You know, she visited her spouse at night and basically drained the life out of him. So it's, yeah, I think me, I'm more of a lumper. I'm more generous in my categories. So I see that this whole vampire belief system going back to very ancient times. And it's based on the simple idea that death is contagious, basically, and that the dead can come back and kill the living, maybe because they're jealous, maybe because they want you to join them, maybe because they're angry with you for something you did while they were alive, and then they're getting revenge. There are lots of reasons given.
Well, in today's culture, at least, you know, for most of the public, when we think of vampire, you know, they're thinking of something like Dracula or one of the characters from like What We Do in the Shadows or something. You know, in today's mind, that's what a vampire is. Where did that idea start? The idea that, you know, there is this, I guess, undead entity that comes alive at night, sleeps in a coffin, turns into a bat. Like, where did all this even come from?
Well, the very basic foundation, the well springs for that belief do exist in European folklore. I mean, that's what people like Bram Stoker and others who wrote about vampires in the beginning of the Gothic tradition, the Romantic tradition, 1800s. Those were the images they were using from the actual folklore of Eastern and Northern Europe, where it, unlike New England, in the European tradition, almost any series of unexplainable or inexplicable or mysterious deaths might be blamed on somebody who was already dead, and then that would be designated as the vampire. And in many of those traditions and legends that define the traditions, the corpse would actually leave the grave. People would see Herr Müller outside at night near a pub when actually he was supposed to be dead and in the grave. And then people might start dying of whatever they couldn't explain. You might have an accident that seemed avoidable. In one case, somebody fell off an ox cart and died. And people said, well, that's not natural. That shouldn't happen. And so they went looking for the vampire that caused that.
Now, how, you know, I don't know how to ask this right. Like they took this stuff very seriously back then. Like this was, you know, now we can kind of chuckle about it, you know, and you know, appreciate the folklore, but at the same time recognize it as such. But back then, this was very real for these people, wasn't it?
No, absolutely. I mean, it was literally a matter of life and death. If you didn't identify what was killing people, then more people would die, and maybe the ones you loved. And so it wasn't a boogeyman thing,
right?
I mean, that's also part of our folk traditions. These stories that are that exist, that function really to frighten young people and children away from doing things that are dangerous. Avoiding certain people, avoiding certain places, avoiding certain activities. And so, there are a whole genre of folk stories that function to do that, to warn people, especially children, away from dangerous things. But the vampire stories were not really in the boogeyman category, and later they might have become that way.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. A lot of, we've interviewed a couple folklorists on here, and a theme in folklore seems to be like there's a lesson in there. Like you said, like the boogeyman, like, we create these stories so that kids don't go wandering off in the woods at night and doing dangerous things. But with
Well,
vampires,
yes.
it doesn't seem like there is a warning or lesson in that folklore, or is there? And I'm just missing it.
Well, there can be if you put it in a broader cultural context and start looking at in the European tradition, why did people become vampires? And as I alluded to earlier, sometimes it's because you did not perform the right duties and responsibilities and rituals to people. And so one of those people that you neglected or dissed or disrespected or failed to perform whatever you're supposed to perform, that person might come back to harm you. So the lesson there is let's enact the roles of the way the culture tells us to. We have certain responsibilities and certain rights. So if you're responsible to do this for this person and that for this person, then do that. Because if you don't do that, that person dies, may come back and take you with them.
I mean,
so I guess you could say in a sense, it's an extended boogeyman thing, but it wasn't in jest. It wasn't in fun. It was deadly,
right?
Serious, literally deadly serious.
Now, what you're describing, especially as when we first started talking, you were kind of talking about New England, Rhode Island, how this vampire folklore kind of started. And then we talk about the European model or folklore, I guess we could say. Those two seem very, very different. Or am I wrong? Like, because European, it sounds like it's like the Dracula-ish kind of stuff going on, whereas here in America, what you're describing is more of I don't even know the right word for it. It's just we're missing the part where it gets out of the grave.
Folk women, yeah,
right.
No, I think you're exactly right, and I think that's a very important point to make. The difference between the American system and the European system, and I think there are some good reasons for that, and I think that has to do with how it came here from Europe, and once it got here, what happened.
Yeah, because a lot of the stories, we were interviewing something a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about like Scottish folklore and how it came to America and how it influenced Halloween. It seems like a lot of that stuff was carried over. So why and how did this one get changed so dramatically? Because we go from this figure to no, they're actually, they just stay in the grave and these things happen. That's a very big difference in the folklore. How did that?
Well, that's always been the intriguing question, a mystery. How did a European folk belief that was basically continental, Eastern, Northern Europe, not from Great Britain, really. They did not have a very strong vampire tradition at all. They may have had similar figures of lower mythology and so on, but they didn't really have the vampire figure that we have in other parts of continental Europe. And I think a clue is actually the very first case that I found in terms of chronology, and that's from 1784 in the town of Willington, Connecticut. So a town selectman wrote a letter to the newspaper warning people about a foreign quack doctor who was in town, telling people he could cure consumption. And he said he actually did, I don't know how he did it, whether he cajoled him or warned him, but he actually helped one of our townsmen, Isaac Johnson, exhume the bodies of two of his children to try to stop consumption in the family. And they were looking for a vine in that case too, as well as vital organs that had fresh blood. So to me, that's a real hint. A foreign quack doctor. Now, this is 1784. This is immediately following the American Revolution. And we know during the American Revolution, the British hired mercenaries to fight because they didn't have enough of their own soldiers to take care of the rebellious colonists. And many of them came from Germany and other parts of Northern and Eastern Europe, the Hessians. They weren't all Germans, but they were Polish, Germans, Hungarians, other other nationalities or ethnic groups in Europe.
Huh.
And I think that some of them must have brought this belief with them. A lot of these mercenaries stayed here. Well, some were captured and remained here, and some decided to stay here because it seemed like a much better situation than the one they left in Europe. I mean, if they had a great time going on in Europe, they probably didn't want to sign up to be killed in the British Army. They probably needed the money, and so once here, many of them stayed, and I'm sure that a lot of them folklore travels with people. They don't leave their folk beliefs and traditions and stories behind. They bring them with them, and their folk cures are part of that. Well, so I think they brought those cures with them, and that was one way to make a living in those days, is to travel around from city to city or town to town and offer cures.
Yeah, that's an interesting point that I never thought of, because the Hessians, like you said, predominantly German, that area. And that's kind of the area of Europe, like at least me as, not a vampire researcher. Right. Like I kind of associate vampires with, Germany,
right.
Of course, Transylvania, right? Like that Eastern European side.
Sure. But
that actually makes a lot of sense.
Well, to finish on the same line of inquiry that you've started, which is why when it was here, was it not the full-blown tradition of leaving the grave and on and on? And I think because these foreign practitioners, call them quacks if you want, they were not selling an entire folk tradition, they were selling a cure. So the pragmatic Yankees who were living here were like, tell me what I have to do to stop this, and I'll do it. I don't need to know, and you don't need to tell me, how this happened, why this happened, and because it didn't fit into the cultural context here anyway. And so they were still selling a simple cure, and so it became, I think, here simply a folk remedy. And it was called by some of the people who were involved in performing the rituals the old folk remedy. That's what George Brown called it when he consented to have Mercy Brown and Mercy's sister and Mercy's mother, George's wife, their bodies taken out and examined. That was in 1892 in Exeter, Rhode Island. Well, probably the last well-documented case of this tradition in the New England.
Right. So when did that kind of die out? Like you said, 1892. At that point, because of the Civil War and other things, like we started to learn a lot more about medicine and kind of what works and what doesn't. Like I would like to think there's probably not people doing that today in 2025.
Well,
but I say that like kind of like maybe there is.
Yeah. Well, I did find a case, and it's been documented from the mountains of Pennsylvania in 1949.
Okay.
So, I mean,
not that long.
Yeah.
You remember what part of Pennsylvania it was?
Not far from Allentown.
Oh.
It's in the Alleghenies.
Yeah.
Actually in a community that was ethnically German-based community. And
damn Germans.
I think, but we all do stuff.
Oh yeah, I know. I'm just messing.
I know. But why it died out, I think, for one thing, 10 years before Mercy Brown's exhumation, which was in 1892, in 1882, a German scientist, Edward Koch, announced his discovery of the tuberculosis bacillum. So from 1892 on, people who wanted to believe science knew that there was now we knew what it costed. And
how to fix it, sort of.
Well, how to fix it came much later, unfortunately. I mean, Dr. Koch actually tried experiments with inoculating people and so on, and actually some of the patients died because it just didn't know, they didn't have it down. It was a bacterium. and they didn't have antibiotics. It wasn't until like 1942 when streptomycin was created that they had an effective drug that would treat tuberculosis. But having unknown cause meant that people could take measures, and that's why drinking fountains became common, because they said, well, we got to get rid of this dipper in the bucket thing because that's spreading the disease.
Yeah, I get it.
And so all over the country, states were mandating, well, we got to have a safe water delivery system for the public, and that's how the water fountains that we know of were invented. In Rhode Island, they're called bubblers. And you know where they're also called bubblers? Wisconsin. And you know why? Because it was a brand name, the Bubbler Company, that sold these, and Rhode Island was one of the states that bought them. So they're still called bubblers in Rhode Island, and they're still called bubblers in Wisconsin.
Yeah, I've never heard that term before, but I guess it makes sense, right? I don't know, whatever.
Right. So anyway, they knew that they had to get some cleanliness standards. No spitting, no more spitting in the streets. Wash your hands. People who have suffering from tuberculosis were isolated from other people in sanitariums so they didn't spread it. So those measures did greatly decrease the number of deaths caused by tuberculosis. So obviously, if you're embalming people, which started becoming popular after Lincoln's corpse was embalmed and he was sent from Washington on the train to Springfield to be interred. Embalming became, during and after the Civil War, much more popular. And so, if you drain the blood out of a corpse and then put some chemicals in there, you're not going to have somebody looking for those chemicals like blood.
Well, so despite all this, they're figuring out tuberculosis. 1942, they're kind of like, okay, we think we figured out how to cure this. The legend of the vampire persists. So where we're at today with vampires, I don't need to tell you, anybody that knows anything about anything knows how current society thinks of vampires. And the idea of that, the European one kind of has seemed to take over. The idea of we have somebody who sleeps in a coffin, all that stuff we mentioned earlier. Why do you think that this is one piece of folklore that not only has survived but has flourished? It might actually be one of the more mainstream aspects of folklore to go mainstream.
Well, I think it's mainly because of the literary and then later the popular culture images that were promulgated, in the guise of vampires.
Right.
In folk tradition, now they're just rotting corpses. That's not, to most people, that's not sexy.
Right. Yeah, sexy.
But the Gothic vampire was, a sexy figure.
Right.
And a lot of the early vampire stories and poetry, the sexual element is not even totally implicit; it's explicit in some places. And so,
well, why? Like, why would they make vampires sexy? The sex sells, or like what's the deal?
Well, sure, because that's an important part of life in literature. If you write a novel without sex in it, I don't know.
Right.
How well, I don't write novels, so I don't have to worry about it. But somewhere, somehow, usually that has to come into the picture because it's an important part of being a human being, or in general, an animal.
Well, do you think, like, so, the idea of sex sells and, having sex in these vampire novels or something. But they're vampires, or women do, in your research and studies, do women fantasize about vampires? Like, I'm not a woman.
I'm guessing some do. But there are other aspects to it too. And one is the immortality tag. Okay. Let's not underestimate the the drawing power of immortality.
Living forever. I don't know.
Yeah, vampires don't die, or at least it's very difficult to kill them, and they live for generations. I mean, sex and immortality. I mean,
it sounds like
those are very exciting drawing cards for someone who's dealing out of hand and wants you to play.
Yeah, well, I think probably part of the reason also is no thanks to like we're in New Orleans right now, and New Orleans kind of has a thriving vampire community, I guess we call it that, and I'm sure Miss Anne Rice had something to do with that. We can still go visit her former home in Garden Street. And from what I understand, not being an Anne Rice scholar, the culture and just the city of New Orleans had a big impact on her when she was writing these vampire novels that became famous.
Well, it just so happens that my PhD dissertation was on African American voodoo beliefs and practices.
Yeah, we got that here too. Yeah.
So obviously New Orleans was a very large part of the corpus of materials that I was working with. I was basing my dissertation, which I wrote in 1980 and it was published in 2020.
Right.
It's kind of funny.
Right.
Only 40 years later. But it was based on some field work that, of all things, an Episcopal minister had undertaken in 1935 to basically 1940 throughout the South. He went and he collected on Edison machines and cylinders, recorded over 6,000 hoodoo root workers, doctors, conjurers, whatever you want to call them. And he published that himself in 5 volumes, which consists of about 5,000 pages. And I had the assigned almost impossible task to index his collection. So during that process, I became very familiar with the whole beliefs and practices of the African American voodoo system. So New Orleans obviously was one of the centers for that. So because of its history of immigrants, French, African Americans coming from the islands and into New Orleans, and the combination of African beliefs with European, especially French, imbued Catholicism. It was, I guess, syncretic. Well, and they reinforced each other.
Well, unless I'm just quoting Hollywood or something like that, I do believe that people who practice voodoo, hoodoo, like they have their own folklore about people rising from the dead.
Mm-hmm.
Aren't those?
Sure.
Did they call them zombies or something like that? I think maybe that's where we got that phrase from.
Yeah. But well, the zombie thing, that's basically a Haitian. It's become a worldwide thing through popular culture and literature and film. But I would venture to say most folk traditions somewhere in their past have traditions where people arise from the dead, whether for good or bad, sometimes to perform evil deeds, other times to come back and help people. In fact, people who have studied, folklorists who have studied ghost lore, have made the point that in the overwhelming number of ghost sightings, they're benign.
Right.
The ghosts are there. They're seen, they're heard, they're experienced, but they're not performing evil deeds. They're not harming people. I mean, that's a very minority of ghosts that do that.
I know we're getting slightly off topic, and that's totally fine with me. But the idea of rising from the dead, whether we're talking about vampires coming back, I don't know if they're coming back from the dead; they're actually just dead, or the zombie things. Why do people have this need for us to come back from the dead? Why are these why are these folklores even existing? And so many of them revolve around somebody who is deceased, who's now actually walking around the planet again. Like, do you have any thoughts on where that came from, or what psychological need in us like that helps fulfill? Like, where did that start? Do you know?
I think the idea of death has always been intriguing and mysterious.
That's one way of putting it. Yep.
Because, well, I mean, first of all, I mean, who knows what happens when you die? I mean, we have a lot of theories, and most of them are based on faith,
Sure.
having, believing in something that you can't really demonstrate or prove. So I think these stories and beliefs about the dead coming back, reflect that uncertainty that involved in death and dying. The whole mysterious, I guess you can call it, journey from being alive, and then what happens when you're dead. And so these are ways to take on, as I said before, to fill the vacuum. You don't know. Science can't tell you, but folklore can give you some answers about what happens when you die. And again, we can come back to some of the functions of the stories about death and dying, are really, to keep the living towing whatever line they're supposed to tow in their society and their culture.
Yeah. Well, now that you brought up, African American culture, voodoo, hoodoo, all that stuff in New Orleans. We are in New Orleans, so I have to ask you, one, why did you choose that? Like, that's not something that, a lot of people are like, hey, this is what I want to go study or do, my dissertation on or whatever. Like, why would you? And by the way, I think it's great, but why would you choose that?
Well, I can go back to my childhood and start with some of the stories I heard.
Right.
And my great grandfather actually was from New Orleans. His part of the family, the Pierces, Pierce, they went there from New England. They had come to Boston in 1636. And part of that family went south to New Orleans, and that was his part of the family. And then the other part of the family came from French Canada.
Right, which is
to New Orleans.
New Orleans, too. Yeah.
Yeah. And so my great grandfather was born in New Orleans, George Pierce.
Mm-hmm.
And he became a boxer.
Oh, yeah?
In 1892. Mm-hmm. Boxing was banned in New Orleans. So that's why he went to Louisville, Kentucky.
It's probably about where I've ever been.
Which is where his daughter, my grandmother, and her son, my father, and me were born. And that's why we were born in Louisville. So to get back to the family stories, George Pierce was struck and killed by lightning around, I think it was 1922, 24. And about a year later, my father and my grandmother and her mother, George Pierce's widow, were in their house, and some man had come into the house. She had known him, the grandmother, and he was threatening them. He had them cornered in a downstairs room, and he had a chair, and he was going to start molesting them.
Oh.
And my great grandmother, George Pierce's widow, he'd been dead for a year. She went over to the side of the bookcase and put her hands up and said, "I know George Pierce was a strong man and a kind man, and he will help us. He will come and help us if he can." And my grandmother told me this story, and my father, who was about 10 years old, told me this story. They heard footsteps upstairs in the upstairs room, which is to where George Pierce hung out.
Right.
Come across upstairs, down the stairwell, through the hallway, into the doorway of that room. And the man who was threatening them took off and ran, and they never saw him again. That started me.
I mean, that would be a way to start. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, did that happen? How was that possible? And so that got me interested in folk beliefs. And then when I got degrees in anthropology and archaeology, and then went on to get degrees in folklore and mythology. Mm-hmm. I originally was going to look at folk ballads and folk music because I enjoyed playing and listening to folk music. But then an opportunity came along to work on on the Hoodoo project, and
you just took it.
Well, he said, "We'll pay you as a research assistant if you want to finish indexing this collection." So,
right.
I did that, and once I got into that, it was just fascinating material.
So, what is when it comes to voodoo, hoodoo, the folklore and beliefs of Western Africa, all that stuff. There's a lot of misconceptions out there. Being in New Orleans, we do stuff all the time. In your opinion, what are some of the biggest misconceptions when it comes to voodoo and hoodoo and that system of beliefs?
Well, I think it's a mistake for people who try to trivialize those beliefs. Just like I think it's a mistake to trivialize people's beliefs in general. So I think you have to look at it from the inside out, not from the outside in. You have to get at ground level if you want to put a face on the people who believe and perform these things. So I think looking at social context and cultural context and history helps to make us realize why these certain beliefs exist, how they're used, how they function in a culture and in a society. And I think that African Americans in this country, many came here enslaved. They didn't have much power.
Right. Or none. Yeah.
Right. Well, they had very, very little control over their own destinies, even over their everyday lives in many cases. Mm-hmm. A terrible situation. Yep. But people need to be empowered, just like people need answers. Mm-hmm. People have to feel that they have control over their lives, over their destinies, over what's happening to them. And if you can't do that through what we call as ordinary establishment channels, if that structure isn't in place for you to take advantage of, other people can take advantage of it. You can't, the legal system, so on. Then you will turn to other beliefs and practices to have control over your destiny, over your life, over your social relationships. So you can categorize the Hoodoo beliefs on the basis of what's their context, whether it's courtrooms, that's a large part of it. Success in court,
really,
how to influence the judge.
That's money.
Also,
right?
Success in business. Well, how to stay out of trouble and how to get out of trouble.
Oh, yeah.
When we can't hire lawyers, and nobody cares to defend you. Mm-hmm. You have beliefs that you can sweeten the judge,
right,
by performing certain rituals. It's the same with same with businesses. Right. You can attract customers to your business by performing certain rituals, or bring back lovers, or break up a couple.
Now, for somebody like me, I know a little bit about voodoo, hoodoo, definitely not enough to really speak on it with any authority. But for an outsider looking in, a lot of these things, if I'm being honest, without belittling anybody, they sound ridiculous, right? Mm-hmm. I'm going to like the classic idea of like a love potion, right? Like either I'm going to take it or give it, and then this person's going to fall in love with me. Like that sounds ridiculous. But at the same time, in my mind, it had to have had some success. Otherwise, that would have died out, right? So is it
right? Well, there's a lot. First of all, the title of my dissertation and book was Pattern, Structure, and Logic in African American Hoodoo practice performance, and I defined the logical structure of those beliefs, and they have a rationale and a logic to them for sure. I mean, you can come up with unique rituals. They're not all just passed down from person to person exactly the same, and you can create your own. It's a very creative enterprise. So one person said, if you want to get somebody out of that house, move them out, you want to banish them, get yourself some banana peels, parch them, and then spread those around the doorstep. And they'll just slip and slide right out of that house.
Oh, well, yeah, that would work.
Well, it's banana peels.
Yeah.
So you're taking characteristics that certain ingredients have, and then you're refining those and employing those, putting them to work to do your bidding, to get done what you want to do.
I mean,
you got hot stuff that's going to move somebody. You got sweet things that are going to make somebody attractive or appeal to you. And so you have to know which ingredients to use and how to use them. And you also have to get the whole system is based on the presupposition that everyone has a spirit, and everyone and that spirit can be captured in a sense. Commanded.
Yeah.
You can command that spirit. You just have to know how to do it, what rituals to perform, what ingredients you need to use, how to use them, and how to repeat this ritual. Maybe every night for 9 nights or something like that. You have to work with nature. You have to work with the phases of the moon.
It's funny down here in New Orleans, especially like you can actually drive down the street and see billboards for love potions, call doctor
Sure.
so-and-so
Sure.
or whatever. And, they, of course, go all out in that Hollywood, voodoo practitioner look.
Sure.
Yeah, they're actually advertising love spells on billboards down here.
Sure. Well, and you see that everywhere. I was in Manhattan not long ago, and I had to laugh at the sign. It said there was someone who could read your fortune, and it said, ring the bell.
Right.
To let them know you're here.
Uh-huh.
And I'm like, why do I have to ring the bell?
Yeah.
I'm here. You should know that, right?
Yeah. I mean, I like I said, I'm not belittling anybody's beliefs or, saying anything about negative, but there are a lot of people that I especially down here where it's kind of known and, we're in a touristy area, lots of tourists coming in.
Sure.
I feel like there's definitely a lot of fraudsters as well that just,
Well, yeah, of course. Yeah, I think anytime you have a local tradition of any kind, it can become a tourist attraction, and it creates business for people. I mean, there are almost every city and town, every county has legends, and those legends are used to draw in tourists.
That's true. We do it very well.
Come stay at Lizzie Borden's house in Fall River, Massachusetts.
Yeah,
it's a B&B, so her ghost is still there.
Well, supposedly. I mean, I know some company bought it. I'm not a big fan of the company who bought it. I'm just going to leave it there. But I mean, there's definitely stories about that everywhere. Now, to go back to the vampire thing, though. So here in New Orleans, one of the things I wanted to ask you about were these people who claim to be real vampires today. And, before we started recording, you had mentioned, somebody actually had kind of wrote a whole paper on this.
Yeah.
So what was the gist of this paper, and what did they find out? Because in my mind, I've met a number of these people that claim to be real vampires, and they're nice people. Like I even feel bad saying this, but like in my head, I'm like, you're not a vampire. But then maybe again, just saying that I'm a vampire is good enough. I don't know. Like where is this whole ideation, coming from?
I'm going to admit to John Edgar Browning that I haven't read his book yet.
That's all right.
He's the one that did the research in New Orleans and resulted in a book where he did an ethnography, an anthropological approach to studying self-defined vampires.
Right. Well, just the fact that he chose New Orleans as the location, what he did is.
Well, I think that's where there was a community that was, I don't think you're going to find the communities of people who are self-defined vampires in every other town.
Right. No, it was definitely, when I first met them, I've lived all over the place. It was in New Orleans where I first met these people, and I ended up meeting a number of them. Like I said, they're very nice people. I have nothing negative to say about them, but at the same time, it's very strange to listen.
What did you learn? What did you learn from them? When you talked to them,
essentially, what I learned was, it's hard to say without sounding negative. So what I learned from them specifically was it was almost just like a lifestyle where like they just felt that they were a vampire. It was almost like, and I'm not going to say what I wanted to say there, but there's people and they genuinely believe like they'll acknowledge like, okay, I understand I'm not a real vampire. I don't, sleep in actually some of them do sleep in coffins. Now I said that, they're not out, biting people on the neck, draining their blood.
But they do require blood.
Some of them do. And
yes,
that was where I kind of, that's where I was like, okay, maybe you're a little crazy, and I'm not trying to, like I said, make fun of them or anything, but that's not normal. It's not normal to gather with friends. And, they admitted like, what they'll do is they'll get, at least the ones I talked to, I'm not speaking for all of them. But it was mostly animal blood that they would get. They would, get blood from chickens or pigs or, meat processing plant. And
I guess that's a substitute.
I guess so. Cause I mean, it wasn't a joke. I asked them, I was like, aren't you guys concerned about like hepatitis or any other blood borne diseases? And that's when that's where they're
blood,
like,
blood cures are not unknown.
Well, the other thing,
different traditions.
Well, the other thing that they did that I found was surprising, once again, not speaking for all of them, just the specific ones that I spoke to and talked to them about their lifestyle. Some of them do have, like, let's say there's a group of 10 of them. They do have one person who does get tested regularly. They get their blood tested to make sure they don't have any of these illnesses.
Sure.
And essentially that one person is the donor for that group of, 8 10 people. And they actually get together and drink blood. And it was like, I just have a hard time understanding, what is going on in somebody's mind where they think that that's okay. Maybe once again, I'm really trying not to judge them. It's just so bizarre to me.
Well, I think, I would suggest talk to John Edgar Browning, and he would probably be glad to talk to you about it.
Yeah, because there's a lot of interest in it, and it's just one of those topics. It's so hard, in today's world. I don't want to say anything that's going to offend anybody or anything, but like some of the things that I've seen and talked to people about over my 10 years of living in New Orleans, it's pretty damn bizarre. But they believe it wholeheartedly. Like there are a couple, I almost started to say they didn't sleep in coffins. I actually do know a number of the ones that I talked to that claim they do sleep in a coffin every night. They sleep in a coffin. They only come out at night. They drink human blood.
So does your curiosity make you want to go and ask them more about it? Because see, that would be my basic approach, because that's what I've always, that's what the curiosity about my grandfather coming back from the dead. It led me, I think, into studying folk beliefs and the legends that either reinforce or deny certain beliefs and practices. And so I try to one anthropologist called the approach radical empiricism. So I try to let experience speak for itself. So what I'm trying to do is to back off my own beliefs and attitudes, my own philosophy about things, and try to get inside the person or the group that I'm interested in. And I begin by just having them talk to me about what they do, why they do it. Observation is.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was just really like I wanted to understand. I mean, it on the surface it sounds bizarre, and
right.
I always try to be logical. I appreciate an academic approach, and speaking to people who are academic about things, but at the end of the day, nothing really replaces going out and putting yourself in with these people and trying to understand them, face to face. But even that's hard because a lot of them won't come on camera. I was told by a couple of them, they would talk to me off camera, but they're like, dude, if you put me on a video or a show, I'm going to lose my job. So
I can understand that. Yeah, of course.
Well, I didn't want to keep you forever. I think we're going on. Actually, look at that. I almost nailed it. 1 hour. That's what we aim for every time. But with the idea of, vampires and stuff like that, do you ever see a time where vampires are not an important part of folklore?
Like, not really.
Yeah.
Because the vampires never die,
That's true. Touche.
Seriously.
All right. Well, if anybody wanted to learn more about you and what you are doing, where can they find out about what you have going on?
I've got a new book, if that's...
Yeah, absolutely. What's the new book?
Yeah.
Ta-da! Vampire's Grasp. So I'm assuming people can find that on Amazon.
Sure. It was published last year. This is the newest book.
Okay.
And in this book, I have more than 85 cases documented, mostly in New England or in places where people from New England settled and brought the belief with them. So that's a lot.
Well, I'm going to buy the book and I'm going to read it. And then I'll have you back on the podcast at some point in the future and I'll actually know what I'm talking about instead of like an outsider, trying to understand what's going on. So it's Vampire's Grasp by Michael Bell, right?
Yes.
Cool. All right. Well, I really appreciate you joining me today. And, our brief little talk about vampires and then, kind of branched off into hoodoo and voodoo and all the other stuff, but it all fits in the same bucket, kind of.
It does.
Well, I really appreciate you joining us. And
thank you.
Next time.
This episode was brought to you by Ghost City Tours, your guide to the haunted side of history in over 25 cities nationwide. From restless spirits to unsolved mysteries, our tours bring the dead back to life. Book now for a haunted city near you at ghostcitytours.com.